Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to look at another horrific case with you, a terrifying tale of a woman's vengeance. A humiliated and offended woman is considered to be capable of anything, including revenge, which is harsh, cunning, and sometimes unforeseen. Much of this is dependent on the lady's level of sanity, but one must not underestimate the severity of her pain. This violent feeling might remain hidden within a woman for years, but when it emerges, it destroys everything in its path. The story of the Bobbitt spouses in the early 1990s startled the world, and their surname became a byword, giving rise to the term Bobbitt, which implies to hack or chop. This instance drew more public attention, not only to domestic violence issues, but also to a marital assault, which many people attempted to avoid. Let's go over everything step by step. Who is Lorena Bobbitt? Lorena Leonor Bobbitt, born Gallo, was born on May 15, 1970, in the town of Buque, eastern Guayas, Ecuador, in the province of Chimborazo. She was the youngest kid of a basic, impoverished family. When she was in primary school, her family relocated to Venezuela, settling in Caracas. Lorena grew up to be pretty intelligent. She excelled in school, was conscientious, and goal-oriented. She lost her father as a teenager, and her relationship with her mother, Elvia Gallo, was rocky. After graduating from high school, she opted to relocate to the United States to live with her paternal cousin, Yana Basudi. Her cousin kindly took her in and assisted her with the paperwork for a student visa. However, she was a very conservative woman, so Lorena, who lived in her home, had to follow a tight set of rules, exactly like Yana's own children, as well as perform some household responsibilities. Despite everything, the young woman chose to stay in the United States since she realized it provided her with far more chances than Latin America. Gallo had always been drawn to the beauty profession, so she opted to train as a manicurist. Furthermore, Basudi ran her own beauty salon in the city center, had vast experience in the industry, and was willing to assist her niece in learning the profession by allowing her to see specialist work and practice on her own. Later, her aunt arranged for her to work part-time at her salon, where she met John Bobbitt. About 8 months after arriving in the new nation, the young woman had settled in, enrolled in college, and was working as a manicurist in her relative's salon while gradually saving money. Lorena was getting ready to attend a party with a group of her pals in September 1988. Her aunt gave her explicit instructions on how to behave and when she needed to come home, and she assured her that everything would be okay. The humble young beauty was apprehensive because it was her first time preparing to visit a nightlife business so late at night. Unlike her companions, she wore reasonably modest clothing, applied makeup, and styled her hair fashionably. When she arrived at the nightclub, she was surprised by how carefree and festive the mood was. The arena was packed with young people dancing, having fun, and socializing, and Lorena couldn't help but wonder whether this was the place she'd meet the guy of her dreams. This thinking turned out to be prescient. A few minutes later, she observed an extremely handsome young man staring at her and smiled. He waved to her, and she waved back. Then a young man approached her and introduced himself. He was John Bobbitt, and he couldn't take his gaze away from the young beauty with the somewhat exotic appearance. The guy was attractive, tall, and personable. He cracked jokes and deftly showered praises, so she couldn't resist his allure. They spent the evening dancing and speaking, and then the new acquaintance walked Lorena to her aunt's house. As they said their goodbyes, he asked for her home phone number and promised to contact shortly. Who is John Bobbitt? John Wayne Bobbitt was born on March 24th, 1967, in Buffalo, New York, in the state's northern region. His family had 3 children, and he was the youngest. When the youngster was 3 years old, his father died tragically, and his mother, unable to cope with the shock, ended up in a psychiatric ward after a severe nervous breakdown. All 3 children were placed in the care of their devout aunt and uncle, who wanted to assist their families in this terrible situation. The youngster was still quite small at the time, but the events surely had an impact on his life. The aunt and uncle nurtured the children, strictly according to religious canons. They all went to church on Sundays and did charity activities to benefit individuals in their community. John was not an extraordinary student, but he performed rather well in school. As a teenager, he wanted to pursue a military career. After completing the requisite training and specific preparation at a military academy, the young man entered the Marine Corps, where he demonstrated his courage, discipline, and determination. However, after a few years, the tight rule and the necessity to follow in the army began to wear on him. After leaving the service and gaining some military experience and skills, He was hired as a security guard at one of the city's prominent businesses. However, he later moved employment regularly, never remaining long at one. A quick relationship and a simple wedding. The day after they met, John called Lorena and asked her out on a date, as promised. The young pair strolled through the park, engaging in casual discussion about a variety of topics, and John made it apparent that he intended to prolong their connection. Lorena was not averse to this, but her aunt's standards required her to introduce her lover to her before they could begin a serious relationship. John agreed to all of the terms, and on the designated day, he arrived for supper at the home of his beloved's relative. Bobbitt was really kind, cordial, and considerate, yet he made an attempt to appear serious. He made a good impression on the strict Jana, and after a serious one-on-one chat with the young guy, she agreed to let her niece continue meeting John. 6 months after they began their romantic engagement, the suitor proposed to Lorena, who accepted. She was pleased. She had always wanted a family, children, and her own home. The pair started planning the most important event of their lives, and in June 1989, just after Gallo turned 19, they made their union official. The wedding celebration was rather modest, as the young couple did not have the funds for a spectacular ceremony and instead chose to spend their savings on a honeymoon on the warm ocean shore. They were pleased, but the absence of the bride and groom's parents cast a cloud over the festivities. Instead, their aunts and uncles arrived to share the wonderful occasion with them, and thus the fairy tale concludes. Following their wedding and a beautiful honeymoon, the couple relocated to Virginia and settled in Manassas, a quiet and cozy neighborhood. The first few months of their existence together felt like a fairy tale. They enjoyed each other's presence and expressed mutual affection, caring, and love. However, as the new year of 1990 approached, the situation deteriorated. Lorena initially tried to ignore some of her young husband's cutting words and rudeness, assuming it was just part of the transition period. But one day, when she brought lukewarm soup for supper, her husband simply slammed the plate on the floor and began yelling at her, criticizing her and calling her a bad housewife. She attempted to dispute, claiming that John was to fault because she had summoned him to the table several times, but he was too preoccupied with the television. In retaliation, he slapped her, and she responded in kind. Lorena had always believed she was capable of standing up for herself and would not tolerate mistreatment, but the longer she lived with this man, the more he ruled her, repressing her will, sentiments, and drive to oppose him. John set his own rules in their home and treated his wife as nothing more than an object, continuously criticizing her, physically abusing her, and forcing intercourse even when she refused. Failed motherhood. The young lady mistakenly assumed that if they had a kid together, her husband would soften and stop being nasty. However, it came out that John did not want to have children. As a result, when Lorena informed him of her pregnancy in 1992, he became enraged. He requested that she have an abortion immediately, and they never discussed it again. Lorena procrastinated for several weeks, hoping that her husband would reconsider, but he was insistent and continued to force her to comply. He eventually pushed her to go to the hospital and have the pregnancy terminated, which was a huge shock for her and took a long time to recover from. In actuality, John only wanted to live for pleasure, unburdened by anything. He didn't have a permanent job and made ends meet by working as a bouncer in entertainment venues. If he needed money, he would openly take it from his wife, who worked as a manicurist and highly sought-after makeup artist in a beauty shop. Lorena tried not to complain or tell anybody about what was going on at home, but her friends and colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior. She transformed from a joyous, smiling child to a quiet, tormented shadow of herself. Those around her guessed that things were not going well in her family, but they had no idea how severe it was. Her husband's behavior became more controlling. He kept a careful eye on where she went and who she spoke to. At home, she had to follow the rules he established, and intimacy between them occurred only when John desired it, regardless of Lorena's inclinations. The poor girl was unable to communicate her difficulties with anyone because she felt ashamed and humiliated. On June 22nd, 1993, John and his lifelong military buddy agreed to go to an entertainment venue. The men partied and drank late into the night, leaving Lorena at home alone. She did not wait for her spouse and went to bed at midnight, quickly falling asleep. Around 3 a.m., John arrived home, drunk and excited. He wasted no time and yanked the shirt off his sleeping wife. Lorena didn't understand what was going on when her husband took advantage of her. She asked him to stop and not do this while crying, but he ignored her pleas and tears. After it was over, John just flopped next to her and fell asleep. Lorena, trembling and sobbing, entered the kitchen. She poured herself some water and took a few drinks to calm down, but her sight was drawn to a stand containing enormous, sharp kitchen knives. Her hand reached out on its own and retrieved a carving knife. She returned to the bedroom, where her husband was lying on his back, snoring drunkenly. She gripped his genitals with her left hand, pressed hard, and sliced through with the knife, severing a significant portion of it. John leaped up and screamed in anguish, while Lorena calmly strolled out of the room, went to the garage, and got into her car, speeding away through the city's lonely streets at night. She just came to her senses at an intersection when she noticed a red light at the traffic signal. She looked at her blood-stained hands and realized she still had the severed part of John's body in her left hand. She pulled down the window, threw the hated chunk of flesh out, and kept driving. Lorena went to the home of a close friend, who was taken aback by her nighttime visit and the state she was in. After Lorena told her what had happened, her friend, seeing the gravity of the situation, called the police and dispatched a medical team to the residence where Bobbitt was hurt. Precision surgery throughout the incident. John feverishly tried to stop the bleeding by putting a sheet against the wound. Notably, the groin vein is a large conduit, and its lesion almost usually leads to death from blood loss. However, John was fortunate, if you will, because a clot developed, considerably decreasing the blood loss. The responding medics arrived on time to bring him to the nearest hospital, where he received prompt medical care. The locations of the cut section of his genitalia were then questioned, as it was still conceivable to restore it to its original position while restoring its initial physiological functions. Lorena gave the authorities an approximate location on the road where she had left her husband's anatomical fragment, and after a thorough search, they discovered it. The amputated organ was cleaned with antiseptic, placed in a special container with medical ice, and immediately sent to the hospital where the injured party was already being treated. The surgeon who arrived from the state capital was shocked by the situation's complexity, having never seen anything like it before, yet he went forward with the procedure nevertheless. He performed a novel surgery for the time, which lasted more than 9 hours and was quite successful. Despite the painful amputation of the organ, and the fact that it had been lying on the road for more than an hour, all tissues and vessels were successfully reattached, and the patient began to recover rapidly. Lorena was detained that night and taken to the police station for questioning, as well as to clarify the circumstances and motivations behind her acts. She quickly confessed to everything and told the horrible background that had driven her to such a desperate deed. She described how 4 years of marriage had turned into a nightmare for her, with her husband constantly beating her emotionally and physically and demanding intimacy only when he wanted. Mrs. Bobbitt also mentioned how, about a year ago, her husband pushed her to terminate a pregnancy despite her strong desire to have a child, and how the abortion was a traumatic experience for her. Regarding the incident, she stated that she remembered very little of that night and acted as if she were in a fog. Lorena described how her husband had come home drunk and taken advantage of her, ignoring her attempts to resist. After the incident, she walked to the kitchen for water, and the next thing she remembered was her husband's scream, the sound of the automobile engine, and a portion of his genitalia in her hand as she sat behind the wheel. The case sparked widespread interest in the press and received extensive coverage. Many women, like Lorena, who had experienced domestic violence, as well as feminist organizations that were gaining strength and popularity at the time, rallied in her support. In the early 1990s, ladies who were exposed to mental and physical violence by their husbands tended to remain mute about their situation. Society was still prone to blame the victims, implying that they caused problems or acted inappropriately. It was considered that a wife should be obedient and obey her husband in all situations, and if the husband became dissatisfied and resorted to violence, it was her fault. Intimacy in marriage was viewed as a wife's responsibility that could not be questioned. On the other hand, nearly all men supported John. Many people thought Lorena's behavior would be contagious, prompting other women who had experienced physical and intimate abuse in their marriages to pick up knives as well. Official records show that there were several million of these ladies in the country at the time. The spouses' trials and sentences began practically simultaneously. Lorena officially charged her husband with taking advantage of her on that fateful night, but in court, she detailed years of regular abuse and beatings, emotional violence, and humiliations, as well as the abortion she was forced to have against her will, due to her husband's coercion. John's testimony was confusing. He rejected all claims made against him, although much of what Lorena said was supported by evidence. For example, it was proven that he did not have a steady job or a consistent source of income, but he enjoyed spending time at entertainment places, frequently forcibly or deceptively obtaining money from his wife to do so. Lorena's friends also stated that they had observed bruises and scrapes on her body on multiple occasions, and that she had been depressed for a long time, despite her best efforts not to complain. The court found that the husband had emotionally and physically assaulted his wife throughout their marriage, leading her to despair. However, there was insufficient evidence to prove the accusation of interpersonal violence committed on the night of June 23, 1993, so John was acquitted. He provided many accounts of what transpired that evening, and the jury, which consisted of 9 women and 3 men, declared him not guilty in the autumn of that year. Lorena's trial started in September 1993. She was accused with causing grievous bodily harm to her spouse. Her lawyers said she behaved while suffering from PTSD, which was caused by her husband's continuing emotional and physical abuse. A psychiatric evaluation was undertaken, which showed that she was unconscious of her conduct and hence could not be held liable for them. In early January of the following year, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation, the jury determined that Lorena could not be held criminally liable for her actions since she was insane at the time of the offense. However, she was obliged to complete a 6-week therapy program at a specialized clinic before returning to her prior life. Lorena reverted to her maiden name once their divorce was formally finalized in 1995. What became of John later? John was furious for a long time that his wife received no punishment for her crimes. He resolved to take full advantage of his sudden reputation, attempting to extract as much money as possible from such scandalous renown. John formed his own music band, Severed Parts, but the group was short-lived because it failed to attract public interest. When offered a large fee to star in adult films in the late 1990s, he accepted without hesitation. Thus, he appeared in explicit films like Frankenpenis, A Riff on Frankenstein, and John Wayne Bobbitt, Uncut. John appeared in a few more films of the same genre, but interest in him and his reattached organ faded soon. For a long time, John was anxious to go on various talk shows and give comprehensive interviews, but such opportunities became less common over time, and the story faded from recollection. John then got work as a barman in a Las Vegas entertainment facility, and by his 50s, he was fighting to make ends meet by working as a mover, driver, and pizza delivery man. In 1999, he was given a suspended sentence for theft. In his personal life, during the high-profile court case that captivated the entire country, media found that Bobbitt had an illegitimate son named Andrew, born in 1992 to one of his lovers, Beatrice Williams. In 1994, John faced trial for beating his new girlfriend, Christina Elliott, a nightclub dancer. He served 15 days in jail and was sentenced to probation. In the early 2000s, John was arrested 3 times for beating his then-wife Joanna Farrell. This time, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison for violating his probation. They were officially divorced in 2004. Whatever happened to Lorena? Lorena, unlike her prior spouse, did not take delight in her scandalous notoriety and sought to avoid the spotlight. In 1996, she decided to return to Ecuador, where her mother, Elvia, lived at the time. Lorena made headlines again 6 months later, when her mother accused her of assault. The dispute was settled without going to court, and the women continued to live together. Lorena returned to the United States a year later, opening her own tiny beauty parlor in Washington. In 2007, she launched Lorena's Red Wagon, an organization dedicated to assisting women who have experienced domestic violence. Lorena soon consented to do an interview for the first time in a long time, appearing on CBS News The Morning Show to explain her life after the incident. She has also been on the famed Oprah Winfrey talk show. Lorena was remarried in the mid-2000s. Her new husband's name was Dave Bellinger, and they had a daughter together in 2006. She wanted not to remember her marriage to Bobbitt at all, claiming she did not follow his life after they divorced, a meeting 15 years later. In 2009, over 15 years after their extraordinary legal fights finished, the former spouses met for the first time on the show Insider. John apologized to Lorena for how he treated her during their marriage and stated that he still loved her despite everything. Lorena was deeply saddened by his words, confirming that her ex-husband